Hello, my name's Gavin, and this is Genre Books, and this is the first of many episodes where I'm going to be talking about pulp magazines and the stories therein. This episode is called Why Pulp, and that's a wide enough question. So first I want to tackle it from the idea of pulp as a whole, and then I'm going to drill down to Planet Stories, the specific magazine that I want to be focusing on first. So in general, why pulp? If you're looking for science fiction literature of the 1920s and the 1930s, pulp really is the only place to look. There are no established hardback publishers of science fiction works. The paperback industry doesn't exist yet. Science fiction does exist, but it fights for space with other genres in the slick magazines. This is a pre-television age. There is no established fandom. Pulp brings all of these things and presents science fiction as popular entertainment. It also presents science fiction as scientific fiction, and that's where the fan battles start in the letters pages. It's of cultural importance from a science fiction fan's perspective. Lots of names that you will see in paperbacks from the 50s, 60s, 70s are newer works by or reprints of works by authors who get their first breaks in the pulp magazines. The pulp magazines are also a graveyard from which some names never emerge. There are plenty of writers who pen a few stories and are never heard of again. They go back to their jobs, they find different careers. The paltry pay from pulp magazines is not enough to sustain a writer's life. But within the pages of these colourful magazines, you will find the first efforts of authors whose names become familiar to readers for decades to come, and names that are forgotten, names that are best left forgotten, but occasional moments of brilliance that transcend the sometimes humdrum prose that a quarter of a cent a word will buy you. So that's pulp in general. Why Planet Stories in particular? Again, these are colourful magazines. These are entertaining magazines. They take themselves very seriously at some times and not seriously at all in others. The editorship has a banterous relationship with the readers, as we'll see in later episodes. The writing is not strictly according to scientific rules as some of the competitor magazines would insist upon. The magazine is also consistent in its ethos and its selection of authors, but it doesn't pay much compared to other pulps. On the plus side, Planet Stories is very cheap. Cheap to buy some issues even today. I was able to pick a couple up for £5 each, although I don't have a copy of the first issue, which I'll be talking about today, because that's £300 and that's stupid money. 25 cents at the time is a small price to pay for this list of writers. Ray Cummings, Donald A. Wollheim, Yando Binder, Lee Brackett, Frank Belknap Long, Isaac Asimov, Frederick Brown, Manly Wade Wellman, Clifford D. Simak, Henry Kuttner, Frederick Pohl, Damien Knight, Ray Bradbury, Gardner F. Fox, William Tenn, James Blish, A. Bertram Chandler, Paul Anderson, C.L. Moore, John Jakes, A.E. Van Vogt, Jack Vince, Mac Reynolds, Theodore Sturgeon, Gordon R. Dixon, Eric Frank Russell, Philip K. Dick, E.C. Tubb, Robert Sheckley, August Budrys, and plenty more that you haven't heard of. In 1944, Planet Stories was paying 1 to 1.5 cents per word. In 1953, that rate had been up to 1 to 2 cents per word. For many writers, that amount of money isn't enough to make a living on. Planet Stories was really rather a supplementary income somewhere to send your stories that perhaps have been rejected by some of the top line pulp magazines of the time. But that's also one of Planet Story's strengths. Here we find space opera and planetary romance that you won't find in a Gernsback or a Campbell edited magazine, because it's too fanciful for those gentlemen. Whilst Planet Stories may initially be seen to be skewing towards a juvenile readership, the pre-Campbell feel of these stories attracted some of the older fans, even by this stage, 13 years in after the first Amazing Stories publications. Readers who are longing for perhaps the pre-Gernsback days of the Barrosian adventures that you might find in the Argosy or the Muncie magazine. So let's take a look at issue 1 of Planet Stories. There's no letters page. It seems to have been put together quite quickly. There are only 4 stories, although they are of a longer length than subsequent issues. There's not a lot to choose from in this magazine. The illustrations in this first issue are sparse and uncredited. There is only 1 illustration per story. The adverts, as few as there are largely for other publications, from Love Romances Incorporated, which is a division of Fiction House Incorporated, which publishes Planet Stories. Of course, there's an advert for Charles Atlas. There always is. But the feeling reading the stories, and this is borne out by the reaction in the first crop of letters we'll come to in issue 2 of Planet Stories, is of stories taken from the slush pile, perhaps, of other publications, rejections from other houses. John Murray Reynolds, a pulp veteran, pens the lead story of this first issue of Planet Stories. It gets the cover as well, although the scene depicted on the cover of the magazine doesn't really occur in the story itself. It's the first science fiction story I can recall where we see what is to become a trope of the Scottish engineer, in the form of Mac in this case. There is a long space voyage at the beginning of the story, where we are introduced to the remainder of the crew. It's telegraphed pretty solidly who the traitors might be, but it isn't Jerry Norton, our lantern-jawed hero captain. But landing on Venus, we encounter glamorous, helpful aliens in the forms of the Amazon warriors. We encounter dastardly enemies led by the remnants of the previous expedition to Venus. The enemy's plan is silly. The plan is get gold, go back to Earth, buy more ships, fly back to Venus, get more troops, return to Earth and conquer it. The second story in the magazine is Laurence Manning and Fletcher Pratt's Expedition to Pluto. I'd not read Laurence Manning before, although I had read The Blue Star by Fletcher Pratt. This is the first true unicorn head Ballantine fantasy, adult fantasy book. An Expedition to Pluto shows us a sea dog captain engaged to a female journalist who is also on this mission to Pluto, and the trip is to obtain a specific metal. The fate of the world, it seems, is to find enough beryllium to make other ships. But before this voyage has begun, there's been some changes to the personnel. The mate has been swapped out, and other staff changes have occurred at the last minute. The mate, who is our hero, finds that the captain perhaps is not working towards the best interest of the mission and the crew, or his fiancée. Throughout a number of events, the mate saves the ship from various scrapes. He also saves the girl, naturally. And he butts horns with the captain, who becomes less and less well disposed to him as the mission progresses. On Pluto, they encounter giant amoeba-like aliens, but they also find some dwarfish denizens of underwater caves in Pluto, who they communicate with and who turn against them on the actions of the captain. The question is, why is the captain trying to make this mission fail? The third story is Linton Davies, Warlords of the Moon. There is a civil war on the moon. Our heroes are travelling to the moon, unaware that this civil war is beginning to take place, and they get entangled with it. But the moon forces also turn their attention to Earth and start hitting it with their deadly rays. And a forgettable story, but notable for the fact that in 1939, the very first city they decide to destroy with their new rays is Nagasaki. And the last story in this issue is John Wiggins' Cave Dwellers of Saturn. It depicts a Rome-like Earth future. Our hero is the Centurion, the newly promoted Centurion, Dynamon. He is a former sports star and is promoted to lead this expedition, again to find a rare metal on another planet within the solar system. In this case, below the surface of Saturn. Yes, the solid planet of Saturn. They need this tritium metal to defend Earth against the proto-atomic rays of Mars. There is treachery. There is a previous expedition. But it all works out in the end. All of these stories are silly. All of them are a breeze. All of them are enjoyable. But let's talk about one of the particular authors. Laurence Manning was born in the 19th century. Only just, 1899, and he lived till 1972. He was Canadian by birth and was training for the Royal Flying Corps to fight in World War I when that war ended. In the 1920s, he moved to the US, to New York, with a relative who was a published poet, and began writing first for the American Forests and Forest Life magazine, before gravitating towards science fiction. He was the founder and the president of the American Interplanetary Society, which changed its name later to the American Rocket Society. And in the 1930s, he wrote for a number of science fiction publications. Science Wonder Stories Quarterly, or Wonder Stories, all of those are the same publication under different titles. And that was, they're all Hugo Gernsback edited. He also wrote, obviously, for Planet Stories, as we know, but also The Planeteer, and 20 years later wrote for Fantasy Story magazine and Fantasy Fiction. But writing was never his main career. He actually ran a mail order nursery, growing and sending out plants, shrubs, and whatnot. But he couldn't stay away from writing, and in 1951 he wrote The How and Why of Better Gardening, which was used as a standard textbook by the garden clubs of America until the 1990s. The gardening book probably ended up being his most successful work. There was never a fiction novel, and the return he made in the 1950s to science fiction and fantasy was brief. Expedition to Pluto is his only contribution to Planet Stories, which is why I included him as the featured writer for this first issue. So that was issue 1 of Planet Stories from winter 1939. In the next issue of Planet Stories, we move into the 1940s. And although John Murray Reynolds is still with us, we also have the first appearances from Ray Cummings, Ed L. Rep, Ross Rocklin, A.M. Phillips, Carl Selwyn, and Nelson S. Bond. But before we return to Planet Stories, this channel will be looking at something else first. Until then, bye.